Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sabrina, and I'll be your host for the session. And that being said, today's session is titled Communication for Work Building Language Proficiency, and it's brought to you in collaboration with FFLA. We're excited to partner with them for this webinar, and we're pleased to welcome L. Anthony and Anna Whale for FFLA. At this time, I'd like to turn things to them. So, L and Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm the current president of the Florida Foreign Language Association. Dr. L. Anthony is our past president. And we're just really excited to continue our partnership with CLET. We had a series of webinars in collaboration with CLET last year as well. And so we're looking forward to just continuing that. The Florida Foreign Language Association has a conference every year. This upcoming year in 2025 will be in Gainesville. If anyone is interested in attending, you can check out our website for some information. It's www.ffla.us. And again, we're just really excited to be here with CLET and supporting Patrick in hosting this webinar tonight. So thank you all for being here.
Perfect. So, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing that with us. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Patrick Wallace. So Patrick brings over 30 years of experience in public education, from the classroom to his work with the Department of Education. Fluent in German, he holds a Master of Education with an emphasis on German from Georgia Southern University. Patrick has served at the state level in Georgia supporting world language and dual language immersion programs, bringing both expertise and a deep commitment to language education. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Patrick Wallace. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. I'm blown away by all of you taking some time. I don't know why I'm blown away, because world language educators, we're awesome and we go that extra mile, and you being here tonight is another example of that. So my goal tonight is to make this very worthwhile a few minutes together for you. And as our host said, we're very excited to collaborate with FFLA and thankful for them for allowing us to be here tonight. So I'm going to jump right in because we've got that little time thing. And before we begin, I just want you to maybe put in the chat so I can get an idea of who's here tonight. I know we had people from all over the United States register for the webinar. So maybe you could just real quickly in the chat tell us where you're joining us from and what language and levels you usually teach. I see Ohio. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here from Kansas, Rhode Island, New Jersey. That's awesome. I feel like, and I've always said that we are a family in a large part. I know that's true. And while we work in our different states and our different schools, we are very much a family of educators all engaged in the same work, even though you may find yourself in different situations. So it's always empowering. And I think that's been especially true for us in world language, empowering to connect with others who are doing the work that we're doing, because so many of us too work, especially if you're in a rural district, you might be alone. So that's awesome. I see Miami and California. That's awesome. That is so awesome. Thank y'all so much for sharing that. I wish we had time to just chat together, maybe in a more, if we ever run into each other at a conference, I want to encourage you to come up to me and say hi. I always love meeting teachers from wherever you are, and that's awesome to see everybody here tonight. So I just want to spend a few minutes here at the start to just talk about our goals for today. So my main goal today is that you'll understand how proficiency looks in terms of the levels, in terms of the student output. So what does a novice learner, what is it that they produce, and thinking about the different levels. So that's step number one. And these are all kind of intertwined together when I think about the presentation tonight. The other thing I want us to do is I'm going to share with you a method for looking at your standards. We're going to use the Florida standards as a result, but wherever state you're joining from, of course, you can use this same method that I'm going to share tonight in your standards as well, to help you really thinking about how you're assessing the proficiency levels according to the standards in your state. So I think that will be really, really great. And then also thinking, and goes hand in hand with, along with those other two topics, as we understand those better, how we can structure our communicative tasks to guide students to stretch toward higher levels of proficiency. I always talked about anchoring and stretch. You know, you anchor and you stretch, you grow. We all need a growth mindset, and languages is important. You know, we want our students to continue on their journey for proficiency. So we want them to grow. So we got to stretch. So you're all probably pretty familiar with this infographic. It came out probably about 10 or more years ago. And it's called The Path to Proficiency. And I want us to start tonight. And this is really if we were in a face-to-face workshop, and maybe we will down the road in your state or in a conference. I would really, this would be a part where I would take us a few minutes to like do a turn and talk so that you can kind of share with your neighbor. But I want you to think about a few questions that I'm going to pose here. And when we move through this, I want you to think, we'll think about those questions again at the end. But the first question is, what does language proficiency mean to you? Like, if you think about proficiency, what does proficiency mean to you? That's sort of a broad question, and we're going to use, I'm just thinking about that in a way. It's important for us to think about proficiency and when we set goals as an educator, we need to have a clear idea of what we want our students to reach, because we're in charge of translating that to them. So thinking about just in broad terms, what is proficiency? The second question for you tonight to think about is, how do you describe language proficiency to your students? You know, I think that, of course, we're engaged in the task of teaching language, but it's also about, we're also teaching students about language acquisition. So how do you go about sharing with students about language acquisition? How do you engage them to understand? Because it is an important point for them to understand, just as I share with you tonight, the different levels, and you'll have access to this webinar and this PowerPoint as well related. So maybe that will help you even in your classroom in terms of, you know, talking with students about how they see it on, see proficiency. So, and then the third thing is, how do you describe describe it to your parents? So that's the other big audience that we want to reach as teachers. I think having a good communication with your parents is really helpful in terms of, so not only when we think, so to summarize, what does proficiency mean to you? What does it mean? How do you describe it to your students? And then how do you describe it to your teacher? So just think about that. We don't have time tonight to really go into that, but I want you to, we'll come back to that. And maybe through tonight's information will help you to reach some more thoughts about those three questions, okay? A deeper sort of understanding. So when we talk about language, we talk about four skills, primarily speaking, listening, reading, and writing. We talk about the three modes of communication. We also talk about language and culture together. We know that they're intertwined, right? So we always talk about how culture influences language and vice versa. So they're connected. That's important for us to realize. We also talk about preparing students for the real world, what they're going to encounter when they step outside of our classroom. So that's essentially what we want them to do. We're trying to build their proficiency so that when they move into the wider world, they can take what they've learned in our classroom and apply it in their daily lives and use it in their work or whatever they're doing. And then the fourth thing is, we want it to be student-centered. So we definitely have to make sure that when we're presenting things, that we're thinking about the students we're teaching and helping them understand it. That's why this infographic, I think, was so successful, was that it really, in a visual way, helped students sort of understand what proficiency kind of means. And I've also heard more or seen more recently how people use the ice cream cone analogy to kind of think about too. Whatever graphics you use, I think the purpose is the same. We're trying to describe the process in a visual way for our students to understand. And of course, as teachers, we automatically use graphic organizers, and that's a good thing. So here's a kind of another image that we've seen a lot, and that is this inverted cone from ACTFL, this proficiency cone. And a quick question for the crowd is, does anyone know why the cone is in this shape? Is there a purpose to why it's an inverted cone? I didn't know if anyone, and you can type it in the chat if you know it. There is a purpose for that. Well, Yes, I like expand with knowledge, definitely. That's a good take on it. Any others? So I'm just gonna, it takes more time. That's exactly what I was driving toward too, right? Good job. Yes, so it does depict the amount of time it takes to progress. So when a student starts off at novice low, they're going to progress rather rapidly through the novice sections, but once they hit intermediate, that growth will take more time in the sense that it just takes more time to move to the different level as you move up the level. I was recently tested in German and came in at 4 distinguished. There's a 1 through 5 scale. And I know that that's after more than, 3 decades of work in that. So it takes time to advance. And that's something that your kids also need to understand. So between these different levels, where there's these different sort of sub-levels, if you will. So we could take novice low, for example, and there's a high, there's a mid, and there's a low. It's important to kind of break that down even further for learners so that they understand that as they progress through a level, there's going to be different phases of their progression. And that's why I think it's so important to share this with students so that they begin to know the path. You're trying to, as a teacher, share a vision for where you want them to go. So this is all part of that. So when they're in a new beginning, they're hanging on to the level, right? They just crossed into, let's say they're moving from novice high into intermediate low. So when they're in the low part of intermediate low, they're just hanging on to that level. They peak, as it were, into that level, but they don't have sustained discourse in that level. Mid is where they start to gain more control of that level. So it's more consistent across time. So you'll see that in their work and in the production that they produce. And high is where they're even beginning to then start to transition into that next level. So understanding proficiency, I think, is a critical first piece that a lot of world language teachers need more input on themselves, just because I think it's so critical for us when we look at our students. First of all, we need to have a clear understanding for ourselves so that we can relay that to students, but we also need a clear understanding so that we can share that with students. So if you think about the levels, they're also defined in a way by task. So at the novice level, those are I'm going to use parrot example. Parrots, they communicate minimally, they use words, they repeat a lot of things, list and phrases. And if you think about the novice section, it's really that kind of growth, right? So they're just starting with the language, they're building their vocabulary. You're going to need high levels of input at this level, and and importantly, that the input that you get at each of these levels also has to rise with these levels. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that parrot is kind of the novice. The survivor is the one who can start to create with language. They ask and answer simple questions. They can create sort of statements, simple situations, simple transactions, just like you think about survival. The goal is what do I need to survive? Do they have enough language that if I drop them in Spain, they'd be able to carry on a minimal conversation in order to survive in that environment? And then you have the storyteller who's more at the beginning, like into the advanced level, intermediate, high, advanced level. They're going to be able to narrate across time frames. They're going to be able to handle situations that have complications. And then finally, you're going to have at that superior level someone who's more of in control of their language. They can support opinions, they can hypothesize, they can discuss topics, both concrete and abstract, and they can handle unfamiliar situations. They are very good at that circumlocution activity that teachers have. So these are kind of just a way, in a broad way, to think about those levels. I know that you've probably seen this as well, and I always tried at the state level and even in high school, tried to relate, in addition to describing proficiency and how long it takes to be proficient, I also think about what our goals are, in terms of the workforce. Always relating your work with the workforce, I think, is a really good thing to do. So when you think about how high or what students can do with language, it's good for them to have a clear expectation of that. When you typically in the United States, most students have 2 years of language. We all hear that many times when we talk with parents. Well, I had, 2 years of Spanish and I can say hello and goodbye. So they retain just the minimal amount. 3 years of language, After 3 years, you're getting into the level 3s and level 4s. You're starting to develop a little bit more into the intermediate level. And of course, here in the intermediate level is where the goals are as well for the Seal of Biliteracy and other things. I know that that's also really important. When you think about AP or IB, you're thinking about, getting 4 years in high school, maybe 5. And then, of course, if we think about immersion, which is really, and I'm talking not only about immersion K-5, but having a good advanced continuation of that program as well. So articulating that program is a DLI program into the higher levels and beyond at college and into other things is really important. So, it takes time to grow proficiency. I think that's important for people to understand. And in our work in the classroom, we have so many different things going on. So, but I do think it's really important to always kind of relate our proficiency to what we want students to do so that they see what they can do with the language when they reach certain levels, for sure. And of course, as they advance in the levels, their proficiency, of course, their utility and the reward that that language brings grows as well. So when we look at Florida tonight, I'm going to use Florida. I know you're from all over the United States, and that's super amazing and wonderful. But tonight I'm going to use the Florida standards just for examples a little bit about this method that I'm going to share with you briefly here. And they have 9 standards, and you can see them here. This is a wonderful infographic of Florida. And so when we talk about, well, let me back up. I'm not you probably noticed from the gray in my beard that I'm not a young fella anymore. When I was young, there were a lot of shows on TV, and you might have remember, if you're like me, you might remember the show Dragnet. And there was a character on there called Joe Friday, and he would always just have this line, "Just the facts, ma'am." So I'm going to talk to you about the facts of language proficiency tonight. And that's really the method I want you to take away tonight when you're thinking about your tasks for your students, your performance objectives. They're going to include the facts. So what are the facts? These are the 4 assessment criteria for proficiency levels that I want to introduce you. The first is functions and global tasks. So what are we asking the student to be able to do? So when you're thinking about your lesson planning, thinking about, okay, what is it that I want my students to be able to do? That's the function. That's the task that you've set before them. The A is the accuracy or comprehensibility of that. So the most important thing when it comes to language is that it be comprehensible and be understood. It is about communication. Accuracy is also important and can be improved over time, but the main thing is comprehensibility. So accuracy and comprehensibility, can they be understood in the task that we're asking them to do? And then the C is the context or the content. What are we talking about? What is the task? What is your content that you're using, and what is the setting? If you think about a story, what's the setting for the story that you're developing in your classroom that day? And finally, text type. How much language are they going to use, and how is it going to be organized? What kinds of words are they going to use? Are they going to use sentences? Are they going to use visuals? Are they going to use other things? So when you look at any standard, and I'm just using Florida tonight as an example, they generally I want you to look for the facts. So just think about the facts and then focus on those. And then as you design your task to meet that standard, and you design it with this 4-letter acronym in mind, I think you'll go a long way to thinking about your task or being able to kind of actually visualize and conceptualize what you're trying to do. So if you might have seen this, I don't know if you've seen this before, but if we think about facts across the different proficiency levels. So we'll start at the right and go to the left here. So when we talk about the novice level, the text type is mostly words, right? They're saying single words. They're talking about their world, themselves. If you look at most level 1 books, there's always going to be a section on me, on myself and my family. So starting to build fluency, starting to build comprehensibility. But like I said, you're kind of like that parrot, right? So you're out there and you're just absorbing. It's very critical at this stage of the game that they get a lot of input. So we talk about the core principles of language education, those are also very important. So using language so that your students can can access it and can make it available. That's the importance of using language in the classroom, which is really important. When you think about the intermediate level, the text type is sentences, maybe even connected sentences, maybe in a small way. Daily life, you're talking about your school, you're talking about your hobbies, maybe you're talking about your immediate surroundings. They're becoming a little bit more comprehensible and even more fluent, so they're growing. But this is the survivor stage that I talked about. And when you get into when you get into the advanced level, then you're going to be that storyteller. So your text type is often in paragraphs. You're talking about the community, the larger world. It's mostly fluent. Now, I want you to understand also here that everybody makes errors. The language is messy, right? So even as we try to look at these graphics like the inverted cone or others, and you see lines, just know that these are all blurred, right? So there's always times nobody fits into a box when it comes into this, but I think it's just what I'm trying to say is that these things are, language is messy. So you gotta, but I'm trying in a general way to hit those big parts so you see the difference. And then finally, superior, your extended discourse, your topics, your context is the entire world. You're able to kind of go through the world. You're able to even, think and do crazy things like write poetry, original poetry in the language. You really understand a lot about it. So this is another way to look at it. It's a great another look at that sort of table, if you will. And we look at it in terms of text type, going up from novice to superior. We have words and phrases, sentences, paragraphs, discourse. We go to context. We're talking about aspects of daily life, common settings, some informal settings when we move to intermediate, transactional situations, predictable, familiar topics. So again, even in the intermediate, I want you to notice that it's still very much centered around yourself and your immediate world. But as you move into the advanced and superior, your context grows, right? So you're going to from most informal and formal situations, you're going to personal general interests, and then on up. So this is a great graphic to also kind of show, and if these graphics are helpful for you when you talk to your students about them, please use them. I think it's good sometimes as a language educator, whether it's at the beginning or even it could happen anytime, taking a little time out to be able to kind of share with students where it is you want them to go so that they see the map before them, as it were, and that will really help them conceptualize what you're trying to do as well. And that's also important to think about when we're communicating with parents. How do we make this visible to parents, what we're trying to do? Because many of them, they may or may not have language ability, second language, third language ability, but they've not maybe not had your background as an instructor. So that's a really different perspective as well. So now I'm going to kind of pivot for a moment and talk about specific Florida standards. And here I'm looking at standard 1, which is interpretive listening. So the student will be able to understand and interpret information. That is our function. That's what we want them to be able to do, right? And we want to do it in culturally authentic sources, from culturally authentic sources on a variety of topics. So that's kind of our context, that's what we want them to do. And then we want them to do it in the target language. So let's take a look here at the first area. We'll try to take a look at a couple different proficiency levels with our time tonight. I know that it's short, maybe in a later day or sometime I can come and spend more time with you and take a real in-depth look at these standards and what I'm showing you tonight. But let's take a look at the standard novice low. So novice low to mid, and this is the standard. It says demonstrate understanding of basic words, phrases, and questions about self and personal experiences through gestures, drawings, pictures, and actions. So if we think about our structure of fact here, A is always what we're aiming for in terms of the proficiency level. So it's important when you're in Spanish 1, Spanish 2, Spanish 3, I would encourage you to identify the proficiency level that you're aiming at with your can-do statements, for example, just so students start to see that every day so that they begin to know about how you're doing things. And then when the structure becomes real for them, it will help them to picture what you already know and what you're trying to share with them. So the accuracy is that our function is the demonstrate understanding of basic words, phrases, and questions. And the context is our personal experiences. And the text type is the gestures, drawings, pictures, and actions. So I've just drawn here an example. And that's what I really love about the materials at Collect World Languages. They're really designed with this communicative approach in mind. So this is pulled from page 30 of Reporteros. And this is, and also what I love, I'll say this as well, what I love is the recycling of activities that continues to draw on this. You know, oftentimes we can't just hit something one time and expect students to have it. We have to continually recycle information. So we're going to provide, their I can statement is I can provide basic personal information, and that's actually always listed in our products. And then, so here we have, you know, several different individuals introducing themselves. So this is tied to this function, tied rather to this standard, because you are meeting this standard and you can use this resource to do this standard. And one could envision, and this is of course incorporated into a larger context, but one can envision materials like this, and you used materials like this, maybe from a variety of different sources, but your goal is still the same, just the facts, ma'am, as we would say. We can take another look here at another standard, the same standard rather, but let's look at the intermediate low. So we're moving up the proficiency ladder, as it were. So an intermediate low, in this context, it says use context cues to identify the main idea and essential details on familiar topics expressed in short conversations, presentations, and messages. So again, the A is our accuracy. We're aiming here for intermediate low, so that's important. And you know what I would probably also have is some definition of the different things. That's why all of that I shared with you at the start of our webinar tonight was really an important part of this discussion today. Before you go into this and you explain this to students, you really want to spend the time that they understand how this works. So accuracy, we know, okay, intermediate low, what was an intermediate low? And we'll look at that in a minute. What does an intermediate low mean in terms of my output? What kind of context can I work in? So pretty soon, if you do that, your students will have a pretty good understanding of these different proficiency points. So the function is you're going to main idea and essential details on familiar topics. So main ideas and essential details in what context? On familiar topics. And how is the text? It's expressed in short conversation, presentations, and messages. So intermediate low, you might be thinking, I'm thinking like Spanish 2 perhaps, or, you know, as you're peaking, you know, it's always, like I said, the lines are not as clear cut, but as your students progress and students progress at different levels, you're always aiming for the one that pushes them where the majority of your students want to go. And of course, it's, you know, there's a lot of, there's almost a whole, surely there's a whole different webinar we could do on differentiation in the classroom and how you can structure that for your different levels of proficiency. But I've pulled here an example from Reporteros 2. So this is the second level, and it's applied because we're an intermediate low. We're going to be in the second level of the series. And you can see that we're going to talk about these items, right? So again, I'm just trying to show you no matter what your standards are there, you're going to be able to identify the facts of that standard, and that's going to help you a lot in terms of how you structure your lesson. Most important part of a lesson is knowing the direction, having the map, where you want to go. And once you know where you're going, you can build back and you can design the course. You can share the map with the students so that they get there piece by piece. Um, So we're going to look at another standard here. This is interpersonal communication. So we're taking a step across the standards here in Florida. Again, we're talking about students will be able to engage in conversations and exchange information. So that's our function. What's the task we want the students to do? We want them to engage in conversations, and we want them to exchange information, concept, and ideas. How? Orally and in writing. So that's going to be how you're going to do that, orally in writing, and then you're going to do it in what context? On a variety of topics in culturally appropriate context in the target language. So let's pull the novice low one out here and look at that, kind of take it out for a minute and look at it a little bit closer. Here it is, introducing self and others using basic culturally appropriate greetings. So this is going to be our accuracy level. This is what we're aiming for. This is going to be our function. We're going to introduce ourselves and others. We're going to do it by using basic culturally appropriate greetings, okay? And the text type is going to be greetings. So when you're looking at things that do that, you're looking at activities that will be able to do that for you. So in this case, it's drawn from Reporteros page 33, talking about yourself and doing greetings. Okay, so another example here, this is standard 5, presentational writing. Student will be able to present what? Information, concept, and ideas on a variety of topics in an appropriate content in the target language. So again, if we pull out the first standard there, we're looking at novice low for accuracy. We're looking at the basic information, that's our function, our context. We're using familiar topics. And we're going to text type is going to be learned expressions and phrases rather. So here we have another example. This is drawn from Reporteros 1, page 95. So here they're creating creating a profile for a social media platform, right? So you working on creating a profile, introducing yourself. So this meets this standard. So these situations that are given in the text, in the materials in Reporteros, for example, are chosen with a lot of thought. First of all, I want you to know that these things were really well thought out by the creators, so that you can see that I could take any standard from any state, and we can use these materials to meet that standard, because once we know what the progression is in terms of proficiency, and we know what we're aiming at, and we backward design from that, you create a material that is useful all across the United States, because it's not grounded in individual standards. The standards are aligned to where we want our kids to go. So if your product is aligned to where you want your kids to go, it's a marriage made in heaven in that sense, right? So that's why it's really important. And sometimes when I go out and I talk to districts, really important that you have time to kind of unify around a common curriculum. And there's a lot of good reasons why that's important. Of course, students move from for a variety of different reasons. But I think that's what I really want you to know is, if you understand proficiency, no matter what state you're joining us from here tonight, then you can align your task using this method, this just the facts ma'am method, to really look at your standards, and then aim in your classroom for reaching that standard and using these items, which are all great. So let's take another look. This is standard 6, talking about culture. Of course, I just told you that language and culture are intertwined, so it's really important always to have culturally authentic materials. It's something also that has very strong background in. And then when you look at their resources, you see that in what they've created. But connecting students will, in this standard, it says the students will be able to use the target language to gain knowledge and demonstrate understanding of the relationship among practices, products, and perspectives of cultures other than his or her own. So in this first standard, it says, recognize basic practices and perspectives of cultures where the target language is spoken, such as greetings, holidays, celebrations, etc. So if we use our facts method, of course, our accuracy is right there before us, novice low. Our function is basic practices and perspectives. So we want to recognize culturally basic practices and perspectives. And then we want to do that in the context of the countries and cultures where the target language is spoken. And that's why it's so critically important too that the materials you use show a diaspora, especially in Spanish, but also in French and many other languages, showing a diaspora of viewpoints and perspectives from the different cultures and maybe even subcultures of that. So it's when I think that's a very strong point as well for CLET that I can say is that they do a very good job of interweaving culture into the materials. And I think in our classrooms, our goal is always to interweave. People talk about the weave in language learning, not only just the proficiency, but how do you weave language and culture together? And those two that's such a critical thing and also a webinar by itself, I would say. But our text type here is greetings, holiday celebrations, etc. So I've pulled this example from Reporteros 1 a little bit later in the book, so you can kind of see that, and you'll see it in the actual books that as you move from chapter 1 through the levels, the text type becomes more, right? So the input becomes more, longer, and the words themselves become a little bit difficult. So the whole book is designed to try to move you along that rainbow. I'm trying to think about the word. So I want you to keep this in mind. Proficiency, I asked you earlier at the beginning of this webinar, what does language proficiency mean to you? So I want to talk to you a little bit about performance versus proficiency. So I think it's really important to understand performance is based on instruction, it's practiced, it's familiar content and context, it's demonstrated performance. So you can think about our classrooms as the prep room. When you're in space, for example, let's just use that as an analogy, and you're going to do a spacewalk. Well, the first thing you have to do is go through the compression chamber, right? So you can get acclimated to the environment that's outside the capsule before you step out there. So think about your classroom in that kind of context. What you are is the test area, the decompression chamber before students step out into the real world. In your environment of your classroom, you can control many things when it comes to building proficiency. We control the instruction, the content, the context. In the real world, and when we talk about proficiency, it's independent of curriculum, right? So, it's spontaneous. When you walk out into the streets of Madrid, or if you're walking in the streets of Berlin, it's just life, just life, just life. And it's a broad context, the content. You don't know what will come at you. You don't know what will be around the corner. But I think as you build proficiency, and the way we build proficiency is by building performance. And so as you're in your classroom in that little chamber before they step out into the real world, you're in that environment that you can control, you're preparing them for that journey beyond the capsule. So that's a really important thing for us to understand, the relationship between performance and proficiency. If we think about, and I'm just going to spend the last few minutes here of this time together, and I hope we have more times together, but I'm going to spend the last few minutes here thinking or sharing with you some thoughts about what does it look like in terms of student output as they progress through these different levels, through these different proficiency levels. And that's important for us as educators to understand because we know where we want them to go. And so it's important for us as, as the captain of the ship, as it might were, to know where we're heading. We are the vision casters for our classroom. We are the ones that set up what the vision is we want them to achieve. There's the vision for that day in the classroom, but there's also this larger vision about proficiency and what you can do with it. So if we talk about the interpretive context, when the novice range, in the beginning, it's familiar and memorized words. They're using gestures and visuals to support a lot of that instruction and input. You can identify some basic facts from memorized or familiar words and phrases. And as you start to go up in the interpretive proficiency, and interpretive is always ahead of a lot of other levels, but that's because input is needed before students produce language, right? So it's this, if you see students, the first place you'll probably start to see students start to grow in terms of their proficiency is in interpretive area, because that's going to be important. And when you see this growth in the interpretive area, it signals growth in the other areas as well. So as they cross into the intermediate range, you know, when they're looking at a text of some kind, they're able to identify the topic and some related information when they move into that intermediate low. They can oftentimes, if they've got good control of the intermediate level, they understand the main ideas and key information. They follow the main message, as it were. And then even as and one peak into the next level is when they begin to identify the underlying messages and maybe supporting details. So when you're working on this mode in particular with your students, and you start to see students who dig a little deeper, understand a little bit more about the deeper meaning of the message than or the even supporting details to the main message, that's a student who is peaking a little bit into the next level. And then, of course, when you get to the advanced range, you can do a lot with that. And those are some examples of that. But let's shift to another mode, and that's interpersonal. And I told you that interpretive will always precede interpersonal a lot. But interpersonal, when we talk about that, in the very beginning, we just want them to express basic preferences. I like what you don't like. What is it you do or don't do? So you express basic preferences. As you advance in the novice range and the interpersonal, the goal is that you not only be able to express about yourself, but you'll be able to react to what others are telling you. We do that. Of course, I talked about communication is not only oral, it's visual. So visually, it's important. We do that by default, right? We react. But I'm talking about verbally. As we move up, we express or ask about, we react to opinions. This is a kind of interpersonal discourse that is right there at the top of the novice range. So as we cross into the intermediate range, we're going to express, ask about, and react to some details to opinions. So we're not only going to be able to give our opinion, but we're going to react to other people's opinion, not only with a facial expression, but actually saying something that might be even longer, or asking a follow-up question. As you move into the intermediate range, you're exchanging opinions, you're providing even basic advice. Peaking in the topper portion of that range, you're explaining preferences, opinions, and emotions, and you provide advice. So these are, and then of course, as you get into the advanced, and we could probably take some time and even drill down on each of these things in each of the ranges in terms of student output. Like, what does intermediate range? And you remember I talked in the beginning of this webinar about those sub-levels, right? So we could take this and even drill down further when we're talking about, because I think that's a critical piece for students to understand student output, because once they understand it, they can explain it better. If we're talking about text type, again, going back to my just the facts, ma'am, practiced or memorized words and phrases with the help of gestures or visuals, that's certainly novice range. Memorize words, phrases, simple sentences, that's when you get into that mid-level. They're able to put it together into simple sentences, doesn't have to be complex. And then when they're ready to make that jump to the intermediates, when they're using simple sentences most of the time. And then probably as they transition, they're using those connectors. They're using those conjunctions, those tying sentences together into longer production. Creating simple sentences, creating sentences in series of sentences, using connected sentences to combine and form paragraphs. You think about an English class, and I always think that's a useful thing for us to look at, because when we think about teaching another language other than English, we have this experience of having learned as children English, but we didn't really learn it. So I think sometimes it's good for us to look at English learners in that regard, because you see the same progression as someone who's learning English. And sometimes it's helpful for you as a teacher who's teaching another language other than English to see an English learner progress through that, because that also crystallizes in some way what you're seeing in your students as they talk with that, because we can't go back to where we learned it because we were so young, but you can see it when they learn it. Using a few simple paragraphs, major time frames. I think as you get into intermediate, and especially as you get into the advanced, you have more control over the time frames, and that is certainly really good. So I'm going to leave you with this last sort of, and I love all these visuals here. And again, I would say use them, please, if they're helpful for you in your classrooms, to try to get to that goal, what you want their students to see. You want them to see where you're going, and why you do what you do. As they moving from novice, uh, you're going to request and provide, you're using these action words, if you will. So these are kind of things you'll see in the can-do statements. You're asking simple questions. You're using predictable words, phrases, and sentences. As you move through the intermediate, you're exchanging information. You're interacting to meet needs. You explain with detail. You provide advice. I don't think there's a limit to how many times we can put this information or try to visualize what proficiency looks for a student. So that's why I love different charts and things like that, because each one provides a different way of looking at it. We ask appropriate follow-up questions. You don't just respond, but you ask a follow-up question. That's definitely a sign of the intermediate. You're creating sentences and connecting sentences. And then, of course, in advanced, you're resolving complications, you're providing explanations, comparisons. Although you do comparisons even in the lower levels, it's really also a degree. And that's something I will say too. Just because you're in the advanced level, these are not like you move from one level and the other level no longer applies. These build upon each other. So um, all of this is built like you're building a house, right? So in the novice level, we're laying the foundation. And then, of course, we're starting to frame it in the intermediate. And kids get better at being able to kind of share their thoughts and respond to thoughts. And then the advanced, you're really starting to see, the electricity and the plumbing put in, and it's becoming a real house that we can use and live in. So if you think about it from that context, going into the world is also in that. I love that analogy too of a house as you build it to live in it. But it takes a long time. You got to do a lot of things before you can live in it. So that's where the real world, that's proficiency and not performance. All right, so I want to close off today, and I see I'm running a little bit over time. You'll have to forgive me for that. I'm still a teacher at heart. I always say that. I always will be. We have some, and I've shared some examples from some of our materials tonight, and I hope that was helpful to you. And of course, if you ever need to look at our materials and see what I'm talking about, of course, you just contact us, and we'll be happy to get those to you. But we are proud of our series, the Reportero series, and then really we put that across French and German as well, German being the most recent release, Das Reporter Team. So I think as when you start to look into these materials, you'll see this proficiency progression embedded in the content. And so we've really spent a lot of time and a lot of thought engaging in building a product that is aligned to your standards, but also kind of shows that progression in the product itself. So if you pick up a level 3 Reporteros, you've already been through those other twos, and the tasks that are in there are appropriate for those learners who have already come through those novice stages and they're intermediate. So that's why proficiency is so important. It's the backbone of all we do. So understanding the proficiency framework is critical, I think, for us to not only be effective in the classroom, but even as a publisher to provide materials that are relevant for the work that you're doing. So with that, one other thing I'll say, and I know that maybe hopefully some of you tonight will be at ACTFL here in Philadelphia. If you are, I want to encourage you to come by our booth most definitely. Say hi, I'll be there along with some members of our team, and we'll be delighted to just take a few moments with you and share with you some thoughts, answer any questions you have, and of course, you can always reach out to us otherwise. But if you're in person in Philadelphia, please come by and see us and say hi. We love, love, love teachers. We're all teachers here ourselves, so we know exactly what you're doing. So with that, I think I'm going to op I'm going to open it up for questions. And I think we've had some, correct? Probably.
Yes, that's right. We actually have a few questions. Before that, thank you very much, Patrick, for the insightful presentations. And we are going to start with the questions now. We still have time, so if anyone still has any questions that come up, you feel free to pose them. So let's take a look at the first question, which is more like a comment. So this person gets mixed messages with respect to the AP level coursework. So they've seen that AP has also fallen under intermediate low, for example. So what would be your thoughts on that?
So the AP themes are, of course, important. And one thing I'll say is that all levels, regardless of the proficiency level, the themes are important in AP. So what I like about our products, and hopefully, you'll see that as well, is that those AP themes are revisited throughout the different levels. So of course, in AP, there's that in order to get students to improve their result on the AP exam, we want to push them on that proficiency levels, because by doing so, they're going to get a better score. So I think the thing is, and that's why I spent a little time talking about proficiency tomorrow. The key with AP is to make sure that you're using topics that are connected to the AP themes and that you're building their proficiency in those topics over time. But it's also, and it's rightly so, the AP is designed to measure a student's ability on as a whole in a holistic context. But there are things that I think AP teachers do that help them prepare for the exam in the context of that exam taking place. So I think if I was advising an AP teacher, I'd say always, whatever level if you want your curriculum aligned to achieving the AP at the end of that, if that's your goal for your students, then everything under that has that goal at the top, right? So everything that we use in level 1, 2, 3, 4 are aligned to those AP themes. So we're continually revisiting and revisiting those topics and trying to push students' proficiency. Remember, we're in the performance thing. We can control the environment here. So I think that's the best way to prepare students for AP.
Perfect, thank you. Then the second question we have is, what do you think about using the music originally from country to educate students about language variations using music lyrics? So the cultural expressions, the meanings behind the writings related to love, friendship, family, protest, and so on. And what would you think would be a good and effective way to present it aside or along with musical videos?
So first of all, love, 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 love music, love any of the expressive arts, poetry, any of that you can bring in. And I think that's really a sign of a good curriculum, is that it incorporates a lot of those. And I think you'll see that in our materials as well. So I think, certainly use music. I've used music before, the song text for music. I think you look at that, I think you can provide a lot of supports. So that's what we control in the classroom, right? So even with difficult things, we can provide a lot of support. So for example, when I used to teach music, we'd listen to the song, but we'd also look at the actual song text and start to look at that. So another thing about music is, reusing things multiple times. That's also recycling, as we say, is very important as well for helping students, for helping input stick in their minds. So recycling what you're aiming for with music, with activities, with with other literature. I think all of that is super important. What's so great about being a language teacher is the world is your oyster, right? You got all of this culture, you got the entire thing. We can pull examples from anything. We just have to make sure that the examples that we pull are aligned to our proficiency goals and what the students can handle. So that's your job as a teacher. There's a whole bunch of material out there. I'm going to pull something that I think is going to help. And if it's a little bit more, in your classroom, you're going to have a variety of learners. So providing some layers of support to that, I think is important too for, some students will get it right off and they'll love it. I know for me in the past, music really spoke to students, and even you could teach them a grammar term 20 times, but if you had it in music and they saw it, that was something that stuck. So it's like you just keep throwing bubble gum at the tree and you're going to get some of it to stick.
Perfect. So our next question is, how can teachers teach to extend proficiency levels per year studied while also pushing students to achieve the seal of biliteracy in their states if the seal's proficiency level is above the expected? So for example, expected to get an intermediate low to intermediate mid after 4 years, but the seal is intermediate high.
Right. So when we talk about that, what students can achieve after 3 or 4 years, just know that it varies. Some of your kids after 4 years will be at higher levels of proficiency than others. I think the seal of biliteracy is so tremendous for one, it's just brought a lot of attention and made what we do more visual to a lot of people who, for language, is sort of still an unknown. But I think in terms of aiming, if you're aiming, remember the seals of biliteracy, regardless of what state you're in, the seals of biliteracy are aligned to proficiency. That's the beauty of what I'm showing you tonight. Everything is aligned to proficiency. So if you understand the proficiency progression, you come a long way toward understanding the moving of where you need to move your students to attain the seal of biliteracy in your state, because it does vary from state to state. So I think when we talk about having more students attain the seal, I think part of that is also just as you talk about proficiency and you talk about what it means, you can also talk about this goal of the seal of biliteracy and how they can attain it and what level will they need to reach to be able to get it. But I think it's the total part. It's not the seal of biliteracy in isolation, and it's not proficiency in isolation. All these parts work together like a machine and a vehicle. And so the seal for some students, there's different kinds of gas. Some students run on music and culture. Some students run on their goal oriented. I want to get to that task. Some students may run on a goal, like my goal is to get there. I think life is about the journey and not the destination in that regard, but having clear goals and destinations on a daily, weekly, and even on a larger context of your program. Like my goal for you coming into my class is that in 4 years, you'll be able to pass the AP exam. My goal is that in 4 years, you'll be able to get the seal of biliteracy. Our goal is to try to get you there, but remember, it's a two-way, it requires work. I can't get there for you. My proficiency is not your proficiency, right? So if you want to build it up, my goal is to show you the road, to show you the map, to design things that are designed to get you there. That's my profession. That's what I do. So I think that's the way we need to approach it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Patrick. And I think this will be our last question so far, unless we have any additional ones. This is a program question. So, does reporters work for elementary students, or do you have something else for them? Would you suggest Abigail or something else?
Yes, absolutely. Well, so in answer to your question, each of our textbook series are aligned to different levels, right? So definitely at the elementary level, you'd want to look not at the Reportero series, but at one of our other products like Alba eGael or some of those others. Because when you're looking at learners, that's another thing we have to keep in mind. And again, probably another webinar is thinking about our learners in terms of what they deal with in their world. And so it's important to not take a secondary book and put it in an elementary classroom. I think this is the challenge, for example, with dual language immersion that a lot of dual language immersion teachers have, is finding something that is age appropriate, but yet proficiency forward for them, because often, that has not existed before DLI. So I think that, yeah, so definitely check out our other elementary series, and for help with that, of course, any of our salespeople can help you with that. But yeah.
Great. Thank you for the answer and thank you for those questions to everyone. Just so you know, we just included the link to the catalog and also to request a free sample so you can check those. Before we wrap up, we want to invite you again to explore the Reporter series. Putting the link in the chat right now. So, as Patrick mentioned, this is a fantastic resource for building language skills, sorry. And again, if you're attending ACTFL, we really would love to see you there. You can visit us at booth 1113. And if you are attending, we're also going to share a form now that you can fill so we can keep you up to date of everything we're doing over there. That being said, again, thank you very much, Patrick, and also thank you for FFLA, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Elle, for being with us tonight, and thank you all for joining us. Hope you have a nice evening.
Gracias, danke, merci beaucoup. I wish you all a wonderful week.